Chapter 1. A Scribe Humble Existence. Eldoria was no longer what it once was. Its marble buildings had once shone in the sun, its plazas were full of life, and its markets thrived with trade. Now the plazas were covered in dust, the marble cracked and stained. A heavy sadness hung over the city, and fear showed on the faces of its people. The empire was clearly in decline, and the distant tolling of bells echoed through the empty streets, marking its slow decay. It was a fading city. Its once proud buildings, carved with symbols of past victories and blessings, were now cracked and worn. Marble columns stood damaged, weakened by years of neglect. Dust covered the plazas, and only a few people still walked through them. The life that once filled the city had nearly disappeared. The busy markets were now empty and quiet. Stalls that once sold spices, food, and flowers stood abandoned. The people moved silently, avoiding eye contact, as if afraid of what the city had become. The empire's decline could be felt everywhere in Eldoria. A cold wind moved through the narrow alleys, carrying a sense of despair instead of hope. It seemed to whisper of forgotten gods and growing fear across the land. The distant tolling of bells, once part of daily life, now sounded like a reminder of the empire's slow collapse. The city's former pride had faded into memory, replaced by constant anxiety. A quiet sense of dread hung over Eldoria, felt by everyone even if no one spoke of it. The air in Eldoria felt heavy with unspoken fear. The city's once bright colors had faded, leaving dull grays and deep shadows. Even the sunlight seemed weak, offering little warmth. It revealed cracked walls, damaged artwork, and shuttered windows across the city. The silence was not peaceful but empty, marked by the absence of laughter and song that once filled the streets. The people of Eldoria moved quietly through the fading city, living in silence and caution. The inns that once held lively stories and laughter were now filled with worried talks about food shortages. The grand temples stood mostly empty, their altars covered in dust. The statues of the gods looked worn and lifeless. Even the imperial palace, once a symbol of power, felt weakened, its halls filled with anxious whispers instead of confidence. A deep silence had settled over Eldoria, born from growing fear rather than peace. The city felt as if it were waiting for a disaster already in motion. Roads that once held soldiers and families were now mostly empty, with only a few people moving quickly through the shadows. Crumbling buildings and dusty plazas showed clear signs of decline. The past glory of the city was fading, replaced by uncertainty about the future. A heavy feeling hung in the air, as if something unseen was slowly weakening Eldoria. Its former pride remained only as a distant memory of what it once was. The great archives, once a center of knowledge, had grown quiet and faded. Inside its large halls, Elara walked softly across worn carpets that had lost their bright color. Her life was surrounded by parchment and ink, filled with old writings and forgotten stories. The cool air carried the smell of aging paper and dried ink, adding to the somber atmosphere. Elara spent her days copying old texts. Her routine was simple: the scratch of her quill, the turning of pages, and her focus on preserving ancient words. She worked to rewrite fading scripts so they would last a little longer. The troubles of Eldoria felt distant inside the archives. Within its quiet walls, she found comfort. Her steady work gave her a sense of purpose and order while the world outside grew uncertain. Her workspace was a small corner near an arched window, where soft light protected the fragile manuscripts. An inkwell and a neat stack of parchment sat beside her, with a quill ready for use. Around her were leather-bound notebooks filled with notes and translations. They reflected her careful study and effort to understand the deeper meanings in the ancient texts. Elara followed the same routine every day. She arrived at dawn and left only when the light grew too dim to work. Her meals were simple and often eaten at her desk so she could continue copying texts without interruption. She rarely spoke to the other scribes in the archives. Like her, they focused on their own work, quietly preserving old languages and histories. Their shared task connected them, even in silence. Though she appeared calm, Elara was highly observant. Her sharp eyes noticed the changing behavior of the guards, the urgent whispers near her workspace, and the increasing questions about certain unknown texts. She saw older scribes pause in worry and scholars exchange anxious glances in the reading rooms. Even if she did not fully understand the cause, she could sense that something was wrong. Though she appeared calm, Elara was highly observant. Her sharp eyes noticed the changing behavior of the guards, the urgent whispers near her workspace, and the increasing questions about certain unknown texts. She saw older scribes pause in worry and scholars exchange anxious glances in the reading rooms. Even if she did not fully understand the cause, she could sense that something was wrong. Elara's life was centered in the great archives. News from the imperial court, unrest in the provinces, and warnings from the priests felt distant and unimportant to her. She did not seek power or recognition. Her satisfaction came from completing translations and preserving old texts. She was content with her quiet role, unaware that serious danger was approaching the archives. Focused on her work, she did not yet realize how much was at risk. She traced the outline of a mythical beast drawn on the parchment before her. The manuscript, a collection of stories from the First Age, was difficult to read. The ink had faded, the pages were brittle, and the language was old and rarely used. Still, Elara enjoyed the challenge. She found satisfaction in understanding the text and preserving its stories. Dust floated in the light that entered the archives. Elara paused for a moment, watching it before returning to her work. In these quiet breaks between decoding and writing, the outside world felt far away. The silence of the archives comforted her. To her, it carried the presence of old voices and stories that had survived through generations. The few colleagues who still worked in the archives often praised Elara's dedication. Master Lorian, an elderly scholar with trembling hands, would sometimes stop by and tell her she had a special talent for understanding lost languages. Elara would respond modestly, believing she was simply hard-working rather than gifted. She did not seek praise. She only wanted to preserve the texts. One afternoon, while cleaning a set of ancient astrolabes, Elara overheard two guards speaking near the central entrance. "Scrolls are burning in the northern sector," one guard said quietly. "The flames are destroying everything, even the names written on them." The other guard replied, "It's madness. Maybe the gods really have abandoned us." Elara paused at their words, but after a moment, she returned to polishing the instruments and continued her work. While copying a passage about celestial alignments, a sudden cold wind swept through the archives. The windows rattled, the lamps flickered, and a stack of loose pages fell to the floor. Startled, Elara knelt to gather them. One page caught her attention. It came from an old record filled with detailed lineage names written long ago. As she scanned the unfamiliar names, her fingers resting on the rough paper, she suddenly froze. Her breath caught. Among the list of forgotten nobles and minor lords, Elara saw a name she recognized immediately. It may have been common in Eldoria, but to her it meant everything. It was her family's name. Her fingers tightened around the brittle page. The guard's words echoed in her mind, about flames that consumed names. The faint smell in the air now seemed like burning parchment. She looked around the silent hall of the archives. For the first time, it did not feel safe. The work that once comforted her suddenly seemed fragile. The danger was no longer outside. It had reached the archives, and it threatened her family's name, and her life.